expert opinion told him was the right way to do it, the way other countries did it, in order to politically and culturally protect the system over the long term. Okay. All right. What does this all add up to? Again, sector after sector, it seems to me: unemployment insurance, old age insurance, the banking system, the stock markets, the housing markets. No matter where you look, and you can extend the list even further, you see great deference to inherited values and institutional ways and behaviors and institutional ways of doing business. Artful contriving to do the least amount of disruption to inherited ways of doing things, and trying to contain everything within an inherited framework of legitimacy that comes down from the 19th and early 20th century. All right. One last concluding note here. Didn't we have Ronald? There he is. Okay. Now, to repeat, Ronald Reagan and Franklin Roosevelt aren't usually mentioned in the same breath, but I'm going to mention them here by way of making a final point. And the point I'm going to make is that both Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan were, in some ways, tremendously conspicuous failures in terms of economic policy. And they were both brilliantly successful leaders in terms of their highest political objectives. So let's just remember for a minute the bases of their winning original presidential campaigns. Roosevelt campaigns in 1932 on the promise that he's going to end the Depression, and he doesn't do it. The Depression hangs heavy on the land until 1941. He made a dent, he made a pretty big dent in it, actually. He brings unemployment down from 25% in 1933 to 14% in 1936. That's not chopped liver, but he doesn't ever find the exit, a full exit from this crisis. Similarly, Ronald Reagan campaigned in 1980, if you remember, on the basis that he was going to reduce the federal deficit and especially start to wind down the federal debt to a much more bearable burden. He, in fact, added $2 trillion to the national debt in his 8 years, and his sidekick and successor, George H.W. Bush, added another $1 trillion, most of it on defense spending to fight the Soviet Union, which went out of business in 1989, 90, 91. So you might think that was a pretty misspent $2 or $3 trillion. That's a controversial item. But anyway, the basic point is that both of them were miserable failures on their most salient and hoopla campaign promises of their original and winning presidential campaigns. Okay. Great economic policy failure. But both of them, nonetheless, and maybe for reasons of that economic policy failure, succeeded in securing their deepest political objectives. Okay? Roosevelt's was to make this society less risky for institutions, less risky for individuals. Reagan's greatest political objective was to halt the growth of the welfare state. And in a sense, both of them succeeded in those highest political objectives, very different objectives to be sure, because of their economic policy failure. Now, what do I mean by that? In Reagan's case, you might remember he tried to take on Social Security head-on, and Tip O'Neill, the Democrats, counter-blocked him and didn't let that happen. So instead, there will be a long historical controversy about this. It's certainly not settled yet. It may have been intentional or not, but the effective mechanism that Reagan put in place to block the further growth of the welfare state was a huge expansion of the federal debt. That $3 trillion addition to the debt over the Reagan and Bush 1 years was probably the greatest single obstacle to the expansion of the welfare state in the Clinton years, and the rapid achievement of universal health care in the early Clinton first administration, and so on. So the debt became a great roadblock to further expansion of the welfare state, and thereby accomplished Reagan's highest political objective. Now let's take this analogy back to the New Deal. I'm going to make a pretty controversial statement here, and that is that ending the Depression was not Roosevelt's highest objective. So that when we try to explain to ourselves or make our students understand why the Depression went on as long as it did, part of the answer is because Roosevelt's highest priority was not ending the Depression. It was using this crisis to put in place these policies that he had long envisioned about reducing risk and uncertainty in various economic and social sectors of American life. It's said that the Chinese character for crisis is a fusion of two characters, one for danger and the other for opportunity. And whether that's literally true, some Chinese speakers and readers that I know say it's not quite right, but it's close. Whether it's literally true, that certainly defines, I think, the mindset that Roosevelt had. That this was a crisis, that yes, it was a danger, but oh boy, it presented a golden political opportunity to accomplish reforms that he thought were about a century overdue, that should have been put in place at the dawn of the American encounter with the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, and had gone unattended to for 100 years. Now, my best piece of evidence for this theory, that Roosevelt it's not that he didn't care about ending the Depression, but that he had a higher purpose in mind, was to use this moment of disruption to put in place lasting reforms that would make American life thereafter more secure. And mind you, the success of this is pretty demonstrable. This country had, in the 25 years or so after World War II, its greatest period of economic growth and shared prosperity in all of its history. If any of you have ever read Philip Roth's novel, American Pastoral, wonderful novel, there's a passage early on in that novel where he tries to capture the mood of this society in the immediate post-World War II period. And he says it was the greatest moment of collective inebriation in all of American history. The country was slap-happy with prosperity, widely shared prosperity, the prospect of long-term economic growth, self-congratulation over having fought the good war, and so on. And I dare say it's my view that it is no accident that the civil rights movement emerges and achieves very significant gains by the 1960s in this context of national prosperity, shared prosperity, national self-confidence, and way less volatility and risk in the system than had been true for the preceding century or more before the New Deal. So there's a lot of things converge in this moment that I think are very, very important for the lives of all of us. Okay, here's as close as I can get to a smoking gun piece of evidence about what Roosevelt's real priorities were, and it's his second inaugural address given in January 1937. You can find the document easily online. Your students can read it in a few minutes. It's not very long, it's 4 pages. And it's much of it is kind of conventional boilerplate presidential inaugural address. But there's a passage in here that I think is just absolutely extraordinary and reveals something to us about what Roosevelt's priorities were. This is 1937. The unemployment rate is down to about 14%. That's 11 points below what it was when Roosevelt came in office. National product is starting to pick up. So, as you would expect, he crows in the first several paragraphs of this address about how much things have improved since I came into office 4 years ago. Aren't you better off? It's the kind of thing you'd expect from any president in this circumstance. And he says, for example, I'm quoting, so I have a copy of the speech here. He says, "Our progress out of the Depression is obvious." There's the not very surprising part. "We have come far from the days of stagnation and despair." Well, again, that's not surprising. But then he says something that is truly extraordinary in the annals of presidential addresses. I defy anybody to find any comparable passage, any presidential announcement, anytime. He says, "But such symptoms of prosperity may become portents of disaster." What? Prosperity is a portent of disaster? I mean, if you're not paying attention, you don't really get what he's talking about there. And it's immediately after that, after he said the return of prosperity is portents of disaster, that he says this famous passage you still hear quoted or referred to today about, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished," and so on and so forth. Okay? If you have only a casual acquaintance with that speech or that period, you think he's referring there, he says, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished." You think he's referring to the unemployed, the people who are the victims of this crisis on the ground in the 1930s. But in the context of the speech, you realize what he's talking about is not the people who are temporarily unemployed. He thinks that situation is beginning to right itself. He's talking about the 1/3 of a nation that he thinks has been left out of the mainstream for 100 years. He's talking about African Americans, he's talking about farmers, he's talking about recent immigrant communities, They're the people he wants to bring into the mainstream, and he's afraid, in this passage, that if prosperity returns too quickly and fully, he'll lose the opportunity to finish the job and address the needs of that 1/3 of the nation. He's not, again, even a reasonably attentive reading of the speech tells you he's not talking about the unemployed in the 1930s there. He's talking about people he thinks have been on the margins for generations before this moment. So for him to say that symptoms of prosperity may become portents of disaster is just an extraordinary thing to say. And I have my students read this speech as a way of getting them to think about what were the real long-term strategic objectives of the New Deal. And usually with a little coaching, not much coaching, if you direct their attention to that passage, you can get them thinking along those lines. So that's, I think, if there's a single important thing to take away from this, it is, I think, the idea that the New Deal, in fact, had a coherent, strategic, long-term social and economic vision that animated it, and it was hugely successful in actually achieving that vision. And it laid the platform or built the lattice work or the scaffolding on which this society had at least a generation, if not 2 generations, of extraordinary economic and social well-being in the time after World War II. So that's my thesis about the New Deal, and tomorrow, I guess, we're going to talk about World War II. But this afternoon, we're going to have a general panel discussion about all these matters. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.